in the context of implementing evidence-based interventions. And the third part, I will cover a little bit what we would call skills for implementation. This will be the three key topics we'll covering today. In order to do so, I actually will start a little bit more with cases or case studies, or more or less case examples, and then we will delve a little bit more into theoretical understanding of implementation issues, and at the end we will cover then skill development. So I always like to go over this thing first. So first thing is first, why do we need to actually bother with evidence-based intervention and implementation problems? They seem like a lot of trouble. Why don't we just go and do things? That's one of the thing we usually battle when we go into the field, when you work with implementers or high-level officials that want to go and just do things, and you say, hey, no, we have to be careful with evidence, and then now we also have to be careful with implementation issues. But what are those, and why should we bother with this? Then I would like to remind a famous quote of Dr. Chalmers, Ian Chalmers, a British doctor who was on the forefront of evidence-based medicine. He said, well, first thing, we aspire to do no harm, or at least we aspire to do more good than harm. And then most people say, well, yes, okay, but we mean well when we go into the field and try to help people, right? And in this case, we are only doing prevention. So I go with people, talk with children, talk with teachers, we do workshops and so on. There's really no risk of harm to harm anyone, right? Well, you may be surprised that there's actually a lot of evidence in case studies of rather sometimes simple interventions and sometimes very complex interventions that may play out very differently than you actually expected at the beginning. Yeah, this is all but one case example. I like to use it because it's an interesting example that pinpoints or lets you think about how complex human ecology is, and sometimes very simple interventions may have very, very complex consequences. This one is actually regarded a residential desegregation program. It's the Junkers project. It was a court-mandated desegregation program. So in the US, there's a huge problem nowadays, and in many countries, related to geographical concentration of poverty. And there's a huge understanding or a great agreement that this is usually not good for people when you, beyond your own problems, you have to battle with problems that emerge because a lot of people that is facing the same problems live together in the same area. And in this context, in the context of a judicial process, the court mandated the state to actually move families out of a residential neighborhood where there was a high concentration of poor families. And the expectation, obviously, of doing this is to provide these families a better context for raising children, growing up, and other so what you expect to do when you do this, to offer families to move out of complex neighborhoods and high poverty concentrated neighborhoods, is to actually give them a better chance in life, right? So families in this case were randomly selected and offered to move out of their original neighborhoods where they lived and to move to a middle-class neighborhood, so where they were a lower concentration of families with high poverty rates and other kinds of problems. So what do you think that happened? We would expect that many outcomes of the family would actually improve, that there would be less stress, there would be very different kinds of good things happening to them. And that is why we do research and we do follow-up, and we actually follow up this kind of interventions. There was a 7-year follow-up comparing movers and non-movers. And this time focusing most primarily on what happened to children and adolescent outcomes between 8 and 18 years. What happened with children? The movers, the children that moved out, they got lower academic results. They registered a slight increase in anxiety and depression symptoms. . They showed increase in hyperactive behavior. They showed increase in psychoactive substance use too, which is our primary concern these days. Families also showed a very interesting behavior change because they tended to apply, because they perceived that the neighborhoods were safer, they tended to apply less stringent monitoring, but increased and harsher discipline. But, and this is the interesting thing of things, usually you get a mixed bag. You get things that are well and not that well. They actually increase stability in their incomes. And I like this example because it shows us that when we do interventions, even this one, that seems kind of simple. So moving a family, it's not simple, but the idea of just moving a family out of a neighborhood, and that it can have this very varied kind of effects, positive or expected and unexpected effects. It's a kind of thing I feel nowadays that I've been working a lot in monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We should have more on the forefront when we implement interventions. We need to be very sure that the consequences of what we do can be very wide-reaching. So this is my first point. And then one would say, okay, we got it. But if we implement only evidence-based interventions, I grant you the intervention I presented before you is actually not quite evidence-based, but is quite there is a lot of information that would make you support or believe that it could have worked in better ways. But if we only go now to evidence-based interventions, those interventions that are in the registers, right, that are proven, tested, the kind of things we promote when we teach the universal curriculum, for example. So if we only go with this one, so there's no risk of harming anyone, right? And then I would say, well, it depends. And here I would like to highlight another case, for example. This is a case, I'm not only drawing this time on cases related to substance use prevention, because I think the implementation problems are wide-ranging and they cross many kinds of interventions you would like to address and to promote. This, for example, is called the Project Greenlight, and is actually known to nowadays as the Greenlight failure. It was a project that is focused on incarcerated males, yeah. And the idea was to facilitate their transition to the community, and it was expected and hoped that they would reduce criminal recidivism at the end. And what they did is to apply like an 8-week intensive program and provided many services. They provided abbreviated versions of evidence-based intervention. This one was called the reasoning and rehabilitation. Job readiness, workshops, housing alternatives, prevention-oriented education, family counseling, life skills training. You can see there's a lot going on here in terms of intervention. Networks with community services, individual intervention. So in theory, you look at that and you say, well, there's actually nothing wrong there. What could possibly not work? And in this case, what they found, they also made a follow-up. This is a quasi-experiment, so they were not randomly assigned, but there were balanced groups. And in this case, the treatment group presented at follow-up a higher rearrest rate and actual arrest velocity. They got arrested much quicker, and they had a higher rate of parole revocation than the control group. And you may say, well, why could this have happened? So we are applying things that we know in the literature that should be working, right? So we have this R&R and other kinds we know that should be working. They should have helped them to go through this and actually do better when they leave the incarcerated setting. And there are a few things that I would like to point out. For example, one thing they did is they used, and this will bring us very rapidly into implementation problems. They used very large workshops. For example, for reasoning and rehabilitation, which is a cognitive behavioral program, instead of using what the developers recommended, a group number of 8 to 12 for each workshop, they crammed together about 26. And there are a lot of reasons why you shouldn't do that, theoretical and empirical reasons. But this first one is very interesting because it speaks about capacity. Why would you cram 26 when you actually shouldn't do that? Why would you abbreviate because, as you noted, I highlight underline the version. It says an abbreviated version. So R&R is designed to be implemented in 4 to 6 months, and they did an 8-week workshop. So you can actually guess there's a lot of things that probably didn't cover. And these processes are usually very complex. So cramping together people so you can't really talk with people, you can't control important things that happen here, for example, like differential reinforcement and other things that happen in group dynamics that shouldn't happen. Yeah, and also there were various implementation problems. People did not get an individualized plan, which we actually today we know that is critical for recidivism management. People need to get tailored programs to their tailored problems. For example, every one of the participants got a mandatory workshop on substance use disorders, even if they haven't one. So these kind of things here, probably if you are implementers, I hope it will get you thinking, because this is very usual. You take something and say, and you need to talk with a guy that has money, or you need to talk with the leadership. Say, can't we do this? It's so long, or it's too expensive, or it's can't we just shorten it? What would happen if we really tailor this a little bit and a little that? And that is a big issue. So that is one of the reasons, for example, when we talk about prevention, before you try to tailor a program that has been tested to work, you should develop capacity. That is like a mantra now. So before you do any change on a substantive program, you need to increase your capacity to do it better. And because we usually don't face or measure, it is more usual that we don't measure the consequences of what we do. And as I mentioned before, now that I'm working in various programs on monitoring evaluation, to have adverse consequences of what you do is actually quite more often than you think, because we have trained to think that these things don't happen, or we usually ignore them, and that is a very dangerous thing. And I hope I've made my point very clear. I have more impressive papers where you can see actual workshops that seem very, very, you say, what could go wrong here? And they have a meaningful impact in people's lives, above all, if we work with people in vulnerable settings. So now we can go a little bit more into implementation of EBIs, evidence-based interventions, as a complex problem. Implementation science and evidence-based intervention, they go hand in hand. Yeah, so implementation science emerges in the context of understanding why things that have been tested to work at the end do not work when we go into practice or when we scale up. And a few years back, I won't go into this model. I just want to make a point here. But for example, a few years back, I also was conducting a lecture, for example, in a Paraguayan university, and they asked me to talk about implementation. I found this nice scheme that actually we teach in the UPC community prevention curriculum. And when I saw this, I said, well, this is a very neat model. It's an interesting model. So we have to address community needs. We have to build a team. We have to go into selection of EBIs, implementing, and so on. The interesting thing about this model is what it doesn't tell you. You know, this model is actually a very academic and interesting work. But when I sat back and I drove back into my own experience in implementation, I noticed that there is a lot that you do in practice to make a thing work that is never captured in any of these schemes. It's all the outside work you have to do, which is quite strange sometimes, quite incredible, of the things you need to do to make things work in practice. Is actually a quite complex issue. And then there's another thing I wanted to share with you, an idea, and again, to say implementation science and evidence-based implementation go hand in hand, because we have to work in a world where you have two implementation science. I would say it's about bringing together two worlds, and one world is the world of solving problems of the field, which you can see on the picture where they have this community picture where I have made a note, and the guy's thinking, well, after I take this photo, I have to see why the school principal got into a fight with the facilitator, and I have to mediate this and to make this work, because I can't go on with the program. That is the mindset of the usual implementer you will see around the world, they go and to try to fix things, to make this work, to get a room for a workshop, to solve all this kind of little implementation problems. And on the other hand, we have like the evidence-based intervention scientist, for example, who is thinking about the other kind of problems. But what is the effect of the problem? And the effect of the program is given by, and there we have a nice regression equation. It's very abstract, very complex, and we talk about effects and randomized trials and so on. And these two worlds, they go very difficult. It's a difficult conversation. And the issue about evidence-based implementation is to make these two worlds talk. Yeah. Why would I say that? If I told you, for example, the target or what you want to achieve to the program is to expand this workshop in as many schools as we possibly can, and you tell that to the implementer, the implementer will do a number of things to get this done. They will contact, they will talk with people. They won't look if the school is ready. They won't see if the teachers need it. They won't see if there's a fit with the organization. They won't assess if it is relevant, for example. They will just go and convince everybody to roll up the workshop to as many people as we can. Whereas if we say, well, what we want to do with this workshop is to actually make this workshop to change, for example, the perception or the cultural norms perception of the children. And we measure that. And we tell that to the implementer. Then you can think the implementer will do a number of very different things this time in order to make this happen. And implementation science is about this. Is to make things work, but not anything. You can make anything work in practice, but the implementation science is about making things work that we know that should change things, change outcomes, change circumstances, reduce risk factors, increase protective factors. And this is a very delicate balance that in practice plays out very differently. So when people think one thing or the other, they act very differently and they manage. We always can roll out things, but we cannot always make things change things. I think that is one of the key issues I wanted to share with you today. So, and now through a few very short and brief case examples, I wanted to illustrate a few main ideas about implementation science. So the first one is, as you may see, I'm from Chile. Chile is a very disaster-prone country. We have earthquakes, volcanoes, different kind of disasters very, very frequently. And this case exactly was almost 15 years ago when we had one of the strongest earthquakes registered in history in 8.8. And there are a few pictures. The picture in the center is the one I like the most because Chileans are in the midst of disaster. You can go into any disaster, but there's always one Chilean who picks up the Chilean flag, even if it's dirty or so, and they say, we're proud and we will get out of this. That's one thing. I love my country, so I always talk about that. But this case is not about that. This is cases about, for example, one younger Chilean government official who may or may not have been me. But in this case, he was sitting in his office after the earthquake. He was in charge of a prevention unit in the government. And what happened is the government began to seize funding from different intervention programs to finance reconstruction. So you may see that this is actually quite a difficult scenario. So the government seized half of the budget I was managing at the time to move along a secondary prevention project, like a selective prevention project we had with young children that were involved in pre-delinquent behavior. And obviously, I wanted to make this program move along and in practice, we had all the people that were interventing, the interventors of the program, were not being paid for the last 4 months. And this was a program in particular, it took us almost 5 years to make it happen in the government. So you may see I was not very happy with that. And after 2 weeks waiting for the lawyer of my program to discuss with the lawyer of the Ministry of Interior and to sort this out, and they both thought they were right. So there was a very legal, let's say, well, discussion between them. I decided to take what I would say an active approach, and I went down from my office to the building. I crossed to the building in front, and I asked to talk with the Ministry of Interior accountant. And very politely, I sat with him and explained it about in half an hour why it was very important for us and how much it took us to get this program and what was happening with the children in particular that were exposed to a discontinuity of the program. They were very vulnerable and so on. And after 30 minutes, I actually managed to convince him to give me the money back. And I would say, not that this will always work for you, but I think the takeaway from this story is implementation requires an active approach. Yeah. If I would have sat in the office and waited for the lawyers to work it out, it wouldn't have worked. Probably not in my favor or in favor of my program. The second takeaway, there's always money. It's a matter of who gets it in any kind of situation. And I think that's an interesting thing to think. But then the key takeaway here is implementation is, if you want to implement something, you have to be active in terms of tackling and not waiting for things to happen to you. The second case and the second takeaway is another case. I don't know if you are familiar, for example, with the investigative interview. The investigative interview is a technique you use to interview victims of sexual abuse, above all children, that is designed to reduce recidivism, reduce revictimization, sorry, and to get evidence for a trial in one interview with a child. It is usual everywhere, but above all in our country, that if there's a child that is suspected or have been subjected to a sexual abuse, when they go through the judicial process, they need to tell the story over and over and over again, 2 or 3 times, to the police, to the investigator, to the attorney, to the prosecutor, to the defense, then in the jury. And the idea is to avoid that. The investigative interview is designed to in 20 to 30 minutes to interview the case, get all the facts one time, get it on tape, and then use that as evidence in every stage of the prosecution, of the judicial process. And so there were the midst. This is an interesting case because this time there was the implementing agency was the Office of Prosecutors, right? The Ministerio Público is called in Chile. And they were very set on the idea that who should do this in the structure and the organizational structure were the DAs, were the lawyers, right? The guys that prosecute. They should be the guys that actually tackle these cases and do the interview at the beginning. And then they were required to do 2 things: go through a specific training to master the skills and how you should do it. And then the second thing, very easy in terms of complexity of intervention. The second thing was to, for each interview, they would need to prepare 20 minutes beforehand so they can plan how they would tackle the interview, do the interview, record it. And that would save the children a lot of repetition and interviewing after interviewing with all the bad consequences that would have. And then we were called in. I was a consultant here, and we did like a pre-implementation assessment to see where the barriers would be or what kind of barriers would be. So if I tell you this in this way, you may think it doesn't seem so complicated, but it was actually very, very complicated for the prosecutors to actually be able to implement this for various reasons. So here's a scheme with all the barriers were detected, but I wanted to concentrate on one. And one is the barrier that I actually thought that was the most substantive one. And it was actually the less visible one. And that barrier you can only get to know if you really go and talk with people in a structured way, which I think we usually don't do as much sometimes. But we found out the DAs, and I mean, these guys are prosecutors. They prosecute criminals, drug dealers. They're tough guys. And they were afraid of taking that role. And you mean, what? Why? How? It was a difficult thing to get them to say. But they were afraid. They said, I have children sometimes that I can't stomach the idea of work with a child that has been known to sexual abuse. Others, for example, feared to be assigned to this kind of cases because it would hurt um, their prestige, because they prefer to work, for example, on homicide cases, and so on and so on. But we discovered, for example, that there was actually a specialist unit. There's a specialist unit that works with victims, and they were very, very interested in taking up this role. And this was actually more a problem of a power play, where the head director of the DA's office, which is a lawyer, said no, lawyer shouldn't, because he thinks they should do it. Well, they thought a little bit better about it when they saw a little bit more about this data and who should actually be able to work on this. And then I would say the takeaway of this like case I told you is barriers, or like implementation barriers, may be very, very subtle, but they can be very powerful anyway. And you need to be very, very careful to address and to plan and to look what kind of things could be interfering with your potential implementation, even if the implementation seems quite simple at the end. So the intervention is what I described you, like a training, 20 minutes, and then do the interview. That's not very complex, but the scenarios where you go in can be very, very complex. Okay, the third one. Well, this is actually a good case. This is one of the projects I undertook when Berna was still my boss in Colombo Plan. We worked, for example, in preparing national trainers in Paraguay, in the universal treatment curriculum, and then in this case, the universities over there, they have been very proactive over the years. And they've been rolling out training to many people that actually work in critical services like jails and other services, and they had no training at all in substance use disorders and treatment. And they actually have taken this up and worked through this. So this is actually an interesting example of a positive rollout. There are, I think, many reasons why this time it worked. Actually, we trained the people trained others, and the others began actually working in practice, applying the kind of things we did. And the practice actually changed very dramatically. There are the results of a follow-up where we asked them what kind of new practices they have been implementing in their dealing with people with substance use disorders. And there are a lot of changes. For example, a lot of new practices in intake and case management and organizational development, like record keeping, all kinds of things to work. But the other thing interesting here is when we interviewed them about their job conditions, for example, they said, well, yes, we work more this time. They take a lot of more work, a lot of more difficult work, a lot of difficult cases, but they don't get more payment for it. So this is an interesting case in Cyber, because you can see that on one side we had like a positive impact, yeah, but sometimes you may have conditions in the context that are not so straightforward, or if you don't really anticipate the things that can happen, it may play out in very different directions. The title here is actually Train and Hope. Not that this time didn't work, but most of the times when we work on implementation issues, we tend to focus very, very highly on training. And we suppose that training is the key issue for implementation. It is a key issue, but it is actually not the only one, not the only issue for implementation. Okay, let's go a little bit into more theoretical, things, like we'll conceptualize a little bit more about what we call the most common implementation barriers. The most common implementation barriers I would say are the 6. Like the kind of things, implementation barriers are the kind of things you will face in practice that will hinder the possibility of implementing an intervention or evidence-based intervention up to a standard that would allow you to achieve results. That is the kind of thing we need to think of. And again, you need to think of, it's different just to roll out a thing, to roll out a thing to a standard that will achieve results. I would say this is the key difference here. And it is very easy to get lost between the two kind of scenarios, just implementing or just implementing with a focus on results. I think that is the key issue that you need to have in the back of your mind, and that your teams need to have a very deep understanding of. There's a very huge difference between those two. So the kind of things you will face when you roll out things is, for example, related to the target population. Is there, for example, a good fit between the evidence-based intervention and the target population? Is there a good fit between the evidence-based intervention and the organization where you will be implementing it? Because evidence-based interventions, they're very different in terms of sometimes theories they're working, the kinds of activities, the kinds of structure they have, the kinds of activities. Those are kind of things you need to consider. And target population, mostly the key issue here is acceptability. Sometimes an evidence-based intervention may not be acceptable because in practice it doesn't work very well with people in terms of the times they need to attend, the where they need to go, what they need to do, etc. For example, there's an interesting example difference. For example, a difference between functional family therapy and multisystemic therapy. Both are like a family-oriented therapies that work with youth offenders, but the first one requires the offender to move to a place where they can actually receive the service. And the harder to reach the offenders are sometimes, or the higher risk they are, they will not necessarily go voluntarily above all like teens to an intervention, whereas multisystemic therapy have as a built-in structure to go where they are, to go to the communities, and they have been trained to implement the services in community centers and schools and the family home. Those are two evidence-based interventions, but one fits the target population much better than the other. That's one key thing to think of. The second one is the service provider skill. I would say this is the most addressed barrier in the universe. It's the easiest barrier, I think, to address, is just to work on skill barriers and train. But then there's the big risk here is, I would say, the train a hope approach, is we train and then we hope they will just do it. And it doesn't work like that. You need to train them, and then you need to ensure that there's a context where they actually can deploy their skills and use them. And the second part is actually the harder part. The other key barrier is service provider, and I would say leadership attitudes. The leadership of organization is very, 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 very important. They need to be on board with whatever you do in evidence-based intervention. They need to understand what it is. And the attitudes here refer to, do they perceive that they can do it? Do they value EBIs? How strong is the practice inertia? The practice inertia is, even though if you train people, it is very easy to revert to usual practice. It's very easy. It's very easy. It's actually the biggest challenge you face if wants to train people is to avoid for them to, or to help them to not go back to what you know, because what you know, the practice inertia, what you know how to do before is easier. If you need to implement a new skill, usually it's trickier, it's difficult before you get to experience the positive results of doing differently. We all, and it includes us too, we usually would prefer go back to what we know how to do. Value of evidence-based intervention, valuing it, it's not very clear cut. If there's evidence about something, is that evidence is not evidence in itself. It's not usually convincing, yeah, because leadership and other authorities, they don't decide necessarily based on the data. They decide on implementing one thing or another because of other criteria. And even if it has or hasn't evidence, it sometimes is not a very big factor when big decisions are made. It's one thing we need to face. The other one, I think, is implementing organization. Characteristics of the implementation. The implementing organization actually are very, very key and very little addressed most of the time. And the resources, how organizations allocate time. What kind of procedures they have in place that actually hinder people that you have trained to deploy their skills and practice. How will be, for example, the new evidence-based intervention considered when you do performance assessment? Will you assess if people actually implement evidence-based intervention in practice, or won't you do it? Or will you ask them to do it in their spare time, which is actually very, very usual? Will the organization provide oversight? What about the evaluation culture? This is a key issue because, as I mentioned, evidence-based intervention implementation go hand in hand. You need to assess how things are working in order to actually see if things are going through, and that requires an organization that can collect data, that can read data, and that can act upon data. This is sometimes a process that takes years to develop an organization. What I want to say is you can't assume it is a given, never. Concept and system, this is usual, also a key things that are related to funding, relations, policies, they will always affect. But in this context, when you talk about implementation science, usually there are what some authors say like are stronger factors and like not so strong factors. Usually you work from the intervention to the organization to the context. This is like the best way usually to work in implementation. Instead of focusing like on the big issues, is try to focusing on and moving barriers as you go from the intervention to the organization to outside the context of the intervention. And the last but not least are barriers related to intervention. I already mentioned a few, but there are interventions that are easy, that I would say that stick in terms that they're easy to incorporate in practice, and there are others that are not so easy to incorporate in practice. What you need of intervention that it is teachable, learnable, doable, and accessible. So teachable, that we can teach the skills, that they can learn it within a reasonable frame of time, that they can do it, implement it, and they can actually assess if the intervention is being implemented as it should be. So what I want to say, I've mentioned, and now I'm beginning to wrap up more in the theoretical say. I've make examples and point of cases so you can kind of get a feel of how this feels in practice. But what would say about implementation? So even though we have great deals of advances in evidence in interventions, so the implementation side is catching on. Yeah, but there's a great need to develop more skills and more, I would say, awareness about how to tackle implementation issues in order to get results. Remember, it's not the same to get results than you just implement something. And what we usually find is that the passive methods are favored. So implementation is, well, we will have a task with a set of specific activities that are designed to implement a program of known variables in a context of an organization. On all these activities will have a purpose and constitute like an observable process, and we should have results and indicators of expected benefits. So implementation science is a relatively new field, I would say 20 to 30 years in the making, and it's taking very interesting approaches to developing how to tackle implementation issues in practice or in real world settings. This is the case, for example, I made when I talked about the experience of the earthquake, for example. So the usual approach we can take is let things happen, let things play out, let things move. We can take an intermediate approach, where we can help you, we can give you technical assistance to make things happen. And the third approach is you can take an active role and say we will make things happen. And a key would say takeaway message is implementation science requires an active approach. It's just like facilitation, facilitation requires an active approach. You can't wait passively to transmit information and hope it will get somewhere. Decisions need to be made, organizations need to be changed, procedures need to be reviewed. There's a lot of going on and things you need to do to prepare organizations to actually be ready to implement specific stuff. This is a nice summary question. I would say what kind of things you need here. This is a famous equation from Fixen and Blasé. You need to know what to do. That this is what research will tell us. You need to increase protective factor, for example. How to do it? You need to be interactive. You need to roll out the intervention a certain way. These two are what we would say cover what evidence-based intervention is all about, is research about how, what and how we should deliver certain services to achieve our results. And then on the other part of the context, we will have the enabling context. It's a context when you can actually implement an intervention and make it work. And then you have the quality of implementation. As I said, it's not just implementing something, it's implementing it to a standard that will let you have significant results. Here's a scheme. We'll share this presentation later, but here you can see, for example, our interplay of how systemic factors and capacity of their organization and implementation teams may affect predicted fidelity and sustainability of results. What I mentioned before is usually in implementation science, we distinguish like the weak and the strong factors. The strong factors are related from the intervention to the organization, to the context. You can intervene in the systemic factors, but usually they will have a weaker effect. You get more immediate and more stronger effects on fidelity, working first with having an intervention that's actually easy to use, easy to work with, easy to implement, manualized, structured, where implementers know what they need to do, and then you need to have an enabling context and organization that actually provides the support to do just that. Okay, if you go through the field of implementation science and you say, oh, this is interesting, I will go read a few papers. You will find a lot of different things and models and different kind of approaches. I would say implementation science now these days is very strongly focused on defining like implementation models, like identifying like key factors, and they're doing a lot of case studies. I personally like this framework, which is the framework that was developed by Fixen and Blasé, because it resonates a lot with practice, and my feeling. It resonates a lot. It's useful for practical work and development. And it's called the active implementation framework. To say, well, we need to pay attention to 6 important things when we work in implementation problems. One is the use of interventions, the implementation drivers. Pay attention that there are implementation stages, that things that just don't work linearly. Sometimes they have a very interesting way of working in stages when you roll. You have a implementation team, continuous improvement cycle, and then at last you have like systemic changes. I will go very quickly through them. As I said, usable interventions. You can have interventions that are more easy to teach or more difficult to teach. I've covered this before. I'm making it more systematic now. But interventions need to be, I would say, teachable, learnable, doable. You need to have a structure to teach. People need to understand what kind of skills they need to develop, what kind of things they need to do. They need to produce outputs that we can actually measure, not very complicated ones. And we need to be able to assess in practice if things go through it. So an intervention that relies, for example, in training, but has no training manual or has no competency framework that could help you actually observe how things play out, or do you can actually assess and measure in a way how people are acquiring skills, will be it could work, but it will be much more difficult, and it will require you much more effort to implement that intervention that are very clear cut or clearly designed to address these issues. The implementation drivers. This is, if you want to take away something from this, I would say this one is my favorite one, because it sums up all the kind of problems you need to face. If you read the book of Fixen and Blasé, I highly recommend it, because they tell you the story from how they learned why this is important. And they also support it with a lot of data. But when you read this book, you get a little bit a daunting feeling. There's so much that you need to look at when you think of implementation problems. As I make a few examples, some things are very unexpected, but you need to be open to find a lot of very different things that could interfere. But basically, the model would say you need to, oh, there's some mistranslation. You need to have the organization factors that are referring to decision data for decision support, a facilitating administration and intervention systems. You need to have a clear support of leadership. And there are two kinds of leadership. You need to have support within the organization, which one is we call the adaptive leadership. That's the leadership that solves problems and issues. But you also need technical leadership. You need to develop leadership that understands the issues at hand, the technical issues, and how to actually produce results. And the third part is the part that we usually tackle, is the part of competency. Sorry, there's a mistranslation there. That is the part where we actually work on mentoring, training, selecting people, and making sure that people is able to implement the skills they learn to a high level of fidelity. If all of this works, in theory, would say we would achieve consistent implementation. If we achieve consistent implementation, we will probably get reliable results. More probably. Well, there's always things that may happen, but we're always working about improving the odds that what we do actually will result in socially significant results. Implementation stages, I just wanted to go through this. This is kind of the usual thing we teach in UPC and on universal curriculum. Not there's anything wrong in here, but preparation for implementation takes just one part here, whereas it actually is more like monitoring and evaluation. It goes from the beginning to the end. There's a lot of support activities you need to do to make things work, and I hope I've made a few point examples so you can understand how complex things that you may need to look at. But I would say this model makes a little bit more sense. This is another perspective. The first one is from the perspective of the intervention. This other one is from the perspective of understanding how organizations and systems prepare to receive and implement. So in this case, usually when you start with implementation problems, you will have an exploration phase where you will assess needs, you will examine innovation, and you need to make sure that everybody is on the same page, that they understand, above all leadership, that they understand what is going on, what it will require of the organization, what they will need to do. So when you actually finalize this stage is the part when you usually sign the MOU. When I say, now we have an agreement on what we'll do, this is the stage we'll go. Then you will have the installation. We'll start with training, with preparing organization, preparing implementation drivers, prepare the staff, build sustainability. And then you will start with initial implementation. And when does initial implementation stop? I would say one of the criteria is when you manage that half of the people, or 50% of the people that is working with the achieves a high level of fidelity or quality when they implement an implementation. And then you can scale up to full implementation. This is a rule of thumb. But what I really wanted to make you pay attention is the arrows below this graph. It says 2 to 4 years. It is my experience that this is very true, very true. It takes an organization about 2 to 4, sometimes 5 years to prepare and to incorporate an evidence-based intervention. And for people that work in research, it's sometimes very incomprehensible because they say, well, this works. This is very clear. We should just implement it. It doesn't work like that. And some organizations have been working, for example, it has taken me, I would say 3 years for them to get used to the idea of do pre-post testing. And an organization that wants it, that want to do assessment, that want to do, they were actually prepared for a impact evaluation of a 5-year program. But in the first year program, even if they had funding for it, it was required by the donor. And they really required to do a strong evaluation program. I had to fight my way with everybody in that organization, not fight, but it was a tough sell for them to implement consistently only very basic tools for measuring some outcomes. Yeah. And now 3.5 years later, I'm very happy to hear them when they go into states say, well, we don't do anything without pre-post testing. That's good. But this is the kind of time it will take an organization sometimes to achieve one thing, which is, I haven't even begun to talk with them about randomized trials, but they're on their way. They understand the first thing and they have been implementing one thing. Good. And then you can go to the next one. That's a thing you need to be mindful, because if we plan this kind of interventions for 1 year or 2 years, probably sometimes we will need to think again if you really want things to take on and be implemented consistently after you leave from the organization. This is like a scheme to illustrate just that. The maturity of organization implementation is very important. You go from pilot testing to test efficacy to test effectiveness to scaling up. And these organizations around, they go through same issues, same problems, each time, several times, with different levels of understanding. And this is a thing that is important to understand. And it's not a sprint. We are obsessed with sprints. Sprints are, we need to go running fast. If you work with organizations to implement EBIs and you are here for the long run and you want this to actually take on in the organization, you need to think this more as a marathon. And it's a marathon because you need to take care of yourself, because you get frustrated if things don't work very fast. It takes a lot of talking, a lot of solving, a lot of problem management, and so on. But it's slow. Organization, there will be some that will take it up very fast. Most of the ones I've known, they are not that fast as you would like to. Okay, implementation teams are key. These are the guys that implement. They have the knowledge and skills to intervene. They can effectively utilize this knowledge to actually produce or deliver the services. And usually you need to help them manage the organization and the system changes. This is an important part, and the teams vary the role and vary the ways of they need to work during different stages of the implementation. But I will just leave it here as an idea. Continuous improvement cycles, they're actually very, very important. That's part of an organization that learns that you actually can plan, you can do, you can check if you have achieved what you have done, and then you act again. This seems a very simple cycle, but to implement it systematically, it's actually quite hard. Usually implementation and advice would be to take one thing like this and make it work consistently. And that usually implies for you to, instead of having a big plan and very complex plan, take one skill, one issue, and make sure that this is really implemented well. Because if the models are very complex, sometimes you may not be able to do any like meaningful impact. This is part of the problem of assessing like the capability of an organization for implementation. Well, and system changes are the last one. We tend to concentrate, some people above all that have been working in politics, they tend to concentrate on systemic changes. They think if you change the regulation, it usually will go very quickly down. It's actually not quite like that. Sometimes people think if we change the system, the regulations, the law, the organization will just pick up. And that is a variation of hoping that things will change. Usually organizations will need a lot of support for changing. Okay, and I will take my last topic, and I'm 4 minutes, 5 minutes, but the last, now that I've painted like the big picture, I highly recommend you this specific book I told you, because it's a very interesting book that made you think a lot if you're an implementer or if you are a scientist working on evidence-based intervention. It's interesting because it gives you a very broad perspective of how things actually work in practice when you want actual results. This part, I need to stress it a lot. If you want actual results, you need to do different things than just rolling out things. Okay, skills for implementation. As I said, if you go now and read papers about implementation science, you will find that implementation science is moving into a very interesting phase of formalizing implementation models. And you have very models say you have to pay attention to this, to that, and case studies, I would say. But since the issues of implementation are so varied and so different between countries, also different between subjects. I would say if you really want to go into implementation science, I would say the key issue for you is to develop skills. Yeah, because when problems are so complex that they're difficult to model, then you need to train people that can be prepared to deal with almost anything, that can have the sensitivity, that can interview people, that can talk with implementers, with leadership, and can understand how make things happen. And in this sense, I would say developing like practical implementation skills is a key issue. Here's one model. I like this model very much because it makes a very good description of the kind of things. It resonates with my practice, I would say. It's the kind of things you know at the end of the day, if you have go through a tough implementation process or a different implementation process of EBIs, this is the kind of things you actually need to be doing when it happens. And there's, for example, inspiring stakeholders, building implementation teams, having the ability to understand the problems in terms of data and quantitative data and qualitative data, and to be able to understand what kind of problem it has and act upon it. It's also a key skill. The use of evidence, how to assess the context where you are, how to facilitate the implementation, how to evaluate your implementation, how to plan for sustainability, and how to manage your knowledge. These are results. For example, I've been using and I've constructed a tool to measure your own perception, so to self-assess where your abilities are. And this is, for example, results. We have been in CIGAD working in preparing last year a cohort of prevention mentors. Yeah, and as we know, based on our diagnostic of the problems we face in the region, we know that one key issue is to prepare our mentors in developing and helping them to develop key skills to be able to go into a country and help them to support actual implementation of different kinds of prevention interventions we are promoting. And at the end of the training, I actually asked them to do this instrument and to self-assess, to assess themselves on the level of development of their skills. And as you can see, you can clearly see like three kinds of implementers in terms of mentors. These are only highly skilled. Some of them are university academics. Most of them have worked in implementation of programs in government or in others. We have like three kinds of implementers in this cohort. One of them, I would say, is they're good at all. I would say it's the yellow line. They feel or they self-assess themselves very well in their ability of inspire, building teams. Perhaps a little more unsure about how their ability of assess the context, but they have a broad understanding of all the issues of knowledge management and plans for sustainability and others. Then you have the green line, where they feel that they can tackle, for example, using evidence and assess context, and they can tackle implementation, but they feel they don't have really a good understanding of evaluation in itself, like the process of evaluation, and to plan for sustainability, but they can manage knowledge and other. This is actually an interesting, most of them are in this situation, where they feel they can interact with, they can manage like the high level problem, but they have difficulty in integrating the results and the evidence from your own implementation to make sure that the implementation actually works. And the third one is the one that feels that they have problems in all areas. What I thought was actually quite interesting here, that all of them perceive that they can inspire stakeholders and they can work with them and engage in whatever you do here. But to find like this group that can actually balance all the skills to work with high level leadership and politicians and other, inspire them, convince them, but also can have a strong understanding of the results of your program and use this knowledge of results to actually work with leadership to achieve results. That is kind of a difficult marriage. there are people that are very, very strong on administering, like the relationship with leadership, politicians, and others. And there are the technicians that work in implementation. But if you really want to have an effective implementations, then again, you need to make these two worlds talk and discuss. And for my own research purposes, if you would be interested in self-assess your own implementation skills, you can scan this QR, or I can share the link, and you can do the survey, and I hope it helps you reflect. And if you really would like to have a feedback on your profile, implementation profile skills, you can just send me an email or let me know in the survey, and within 1 or 2 weeks, I will send you back your own self-assessment profile and how it compares to the sample I've accumulated so far. I hope it might help you to reflect on where do you want to go next in terms of developing your skills and implementation science. It is a challenging topic. It's very fascinating. I'm still learning, but I hope this has been an thought-provoking talk for you. And now I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And don't worry, I think that because we are going to send a copy of your presentation, if the link is there, then we'll have participants.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure you'll get like responses from the participants. I have not seen any question from the chat box, but if you do, like, feel free to type it. And I will start though. So thank you. Like, you highlighted a lot of important information regarding knowledge and skills are important, but we also want that, but implementation goes beyond that. Like, I think, but my question is something to do with how do we balance the program fidelity with cultural adaptations, right? Because that sometimes becomes, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. But I think that's why I said that skills are important, because in Chile we have a saying, and I found it to be sadly true. It's if you want to make a cake, you need to break eggs sometime. And as it is in therapy, and you're a psychologist like me, you know, therapy, it's not always nice and cozy. Sometimes you have to confront difficult things. I would say the difficult part for me have been you can be very friendly with leadership and so on, but sometimes you need to confront. And that is usually tough for the implementer or for the guy that's working on monitoring evaluation. Above all, if you are communicating like poor results of something, and then leadership needs to deal with it. And that is a difficult conversation, and that requires a lot of skill to do it in order to make things happen. Having said that, I would say that I'm all for cultural adaptation, but it's so true. It's so true that if you're working with something, you need to hopefully be in touch with the original developer that can help you make an adjustment that doesn't alter a significant part of the program. So if you're facing the need to shorten a program, think again, think twice, think 3 times, consult. Because as I showed at the beginning, actually the shortening program can be quite harmful, because programs are designed, people go through processes. So people are not machines. Yeah, we go through processes. We change, we think, and many interventions in human beings, you will see that usually you have a slight worsening of the situation when you follow up, and then perhaps 1, 2, 3 years after, you begin to find effects. And most of the kind of interventions, the structure where we roll out, are not sensitive to that. They think we can intervene 3 months and then people will just change. And part of the issue of looking at evidence is to understand how people really change, and to not assume that people change in another way. So cultural implementation, fine, up to the point that you begin to affect things that are really important for you to get the results you're looking at. And you're facing that dilemma, then you need to think about increasing capacity. And it's very easy. I've been faced with this issue many times. We will usually take the easier way. When you face a problem, we'll usually try to solve it in an easy way. but sometimes the easy way will not get you the results. And that's, you need to think very hard. What are you looking for? Are you trying to look, like the case, you want to go to 300 schools, or you want 30 that actually survive 5 years and keep implementing? That's a tough question, because many leadership and politicians, they won't be around for the next 5 years and they won't care. But we should care. It's part of the ethical obligations. We have to inform people to help them make this balance, to make this make the kind of decisions that will actually help programs last in time. It's a difficult thing, because you need to go for funding, you need to present results now, you need to, usually you have faced a lot of pressure when you work in NGOs and so on, to present a nice picture and a lot of numbers and a lot of results. But I think more and more we are being faced with this, and people like us, usually, that work in this field, we need to interact with a lot of politicians and management and leadership that want these results right now. And then your role is to psychoeducate. Like, you need to explain how things really work in practice, and how to help them to achieve what they actually also need, and result, but to not assume that people is different than they actually are. I think that's a tough challenge. We usually go and think it's easy, it's mechanic, it's not like that. And then this is a tough, but I think the message is it can be done. There's a lot of information on how to do it. There's a lot of experience and case studies and how to work through this. The challenge is actually make this happen. I would say that's and to help people not to revert to the inertia of practice once you go with this. And one of the ways is, going back to the question, is actually measure implementation fidelity, and to use that and introduce it, for example, within the structure of the organizational performance assessment. And then you make a move that actually helps the organization to introduce it in their usual processes. And if you manage that, the organization will likely keep on doing that in time, more likely than not.
Okay, so we have one last question, and Anthony echoes what I'm thinking about feasibility, pragmatism, and sustainability. His question is something to do with how do we actually improve the implementation in terms of issues of being too costly, unrealistic, or not practical. So we know that there's always a push about implementation of evidence-based practices and interventions, but sometimes when it comes to the realities on the ground, what can we do to improve I would say its implementation in itself, considering cost, feasibility, and other stuff.
I think nowadays cost is a big question, and sometimes I've been working with prevention specialists. They get caught up in the institutional discourse. They say, well, prevention is so expensive. And they say, well, but compared to what parameter are we talking about? And they say, what? And the issue with prevention, you can have results in not so long time. There's this assumption that prevention will only pay out in 5, 10, or 15 years. Well, yes, but you still can measure things that happened before. And regarding costs, I completely agree. There are many things that we need to do for an intervention to be effective that are highly costly. For example, motivational interviewing. It's a very proven technique, but how many of you actually do a review of how people is implementing monitoring as a motivational interviewing the right way? Do you transcribe their sessions? Do you examine their utterances? Do you use a trademark instrument to give them feedback? No, because it is highly costly. Well, there's a good news. The good news here, and I am very optimistic about this, and you might find this very strange, but artificial intelligence will help us with that. There are today now in existence applications that can record your sessions and provide you with a feedback of your adherence to the model of motivational interviewing in 10 minutes after each session, and it costs you $20 a month per therapist. that was impossible to do a few years back. So I would say I'm optimistic about this because the applications of artificial intelligence, they will bring costs of critical things that we can't finance today down a lot, a lot. And then we will be able to concentrate on actually delivering the services we need, administrative offices, administrative work that keeps you keeping record, keeping all these kind of things can be done now by artificial intelligence. It's actually quite amazing. And I'm very sure that if once we begin to integrate this, costs will go down and we will be able to be much, much more effective in this way. I'm sure that's not the answer you wanted, but I'm sure that's a thing that we will find in the next 5 years. I'm absolutely sure about this. And we should start exploring how to make our work easier and how to leverage these interventions to not spend your time on things that are not important. You shouldn't be spending your time on filling out surveys. You should be spending your time on delivering services to people. I think that is key. And this will be a big change that is happening right now. They're viable right now. It's not sci-fi anymore. It's now. It's very impressive. So I would encourage you to look at that.
Yeah, true technology. Like, you can't
Yeah.
resist technology. It's going to be here and it's already part of our cultural
It's
development.
already there. It's there. It's for the taking, not for the taking, but it's there and it works. It works really interesting.
So thank you, Dr. Hein, for sharing your time with us. A lot of our facilitators and audiences are also saying thank you, but you did give me an idea. It seems that there is a long conversation that we have to do with implementation science. And for this year, we are doing our psychopharmacology series, the fourth session of which will be on June 3. So we invite everyone to register and watch that. But next year, we'll actually do an implementation science series. Let's talk from processes determinants to evaluation, which is something that normally is missing from the middle to low income countries. They have the data, but they are actually not utilizing it. So that's something that we can look forward to. And to know more about our programs and future webinars, please visit our website, www.icuddr.org, and follow our social media pages. Caleb actually posted our other information. So again, Andreas, thank you. It was nice seeing you, and a lot of you. Thank you for joining us, and we wish you all a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.